Welcome to Chapter 2, Organizational Structure. As many of you are familiar, in the fire department, it can be considered a paramilitary organization. And in this chapter, we're going to talk about the varying degrees of the organizational structure within a given fire department and the importance of said structure and rank and file. And at the end of this chapter, your assignment is going to be to create an organizational structure chart for your organization or one you would like to work for. And I want you to also do a job description in Word about a specific position within that structure. So it could be firefighter, driver, officer, captain, lieutenant, whatever the case may be. So let's get rolling. Objective 1. Describe the basic principles of an organizational structure. This is a picture of a square structure, which has an uninterrupted series of steps for decisions and feedback. So having an uninterrupted series of steps, or basically a chain of command. This particular structure is very common to most fire and emergency services. Decisions and informations are directed from the top through intermediate levels to base of the structure at the bottom. So looking at this chart here, a good example would be the fire chief decides to dictate a new policy on vacation time. So it would start with the fire chief, filter on down possibly through administration, on to the deputy chief, administration assistant, technical support group, and even accounting for said approval. Now notice that that does not have a direct line to the bottom of our chart where you have the logistics, prevention, training, and operations. So that particular structure does not show a line of succession, meaning that it would stop there. So in order to get the information about the new policy all the way down, the fire chief is going to talk to each of the divisions, logistics, prevention, and training, and operations at the top. So that would be in operations, you would talk to the battalion chiefs, the division chief in training, the captain in inspections, and then the captain in logistics. And then they would in turn reiterate said policy on down that rank of succession. Feedback and information is transmitted from the bottom through the structure's top. However, it can also go, obviously from the top to bottom. So looking at it in reverse, we just talked from the top down. The firefighter, if they had a grievance, then they would go up to their next person in the chain of command, being the senior firefighter, and then that would go on up the chain as need be till they get a resolution to their question or problem. So the features of this particular structure: it directs communications at lower levels, which means quicker action and reactions. Some decision-making authority and delegation can be done at lower levels. For example, the fire chief, though in charge of the department, would not be too concerned, quite possibly, with the day-to-day vacation schedule in the operations section. So he or she would probably give the power, so to speak, to the battalion chief to dictate the vacation schedule and decide how that goes around. Communication is enhanced in this particular structure, and information is centralized for decision making. Another advantage of this particular organizational chart is the fact that it can be divided into line and staff personnel. Line personnel delivers services to the public and and external stakeholders. So these are the guys and gals that are actually on the front lines, riding the fire truck, so to speak, putting out fires, doing friendly firefighter plans, and things of that nature. They handle the EMS calls, investigations, etc. The second division is the staff personnel. And staff personnel basically provide support to the line personnel and internal customers. So they're the ones that get the line people the stuff they need, whether it be training, logistics, equipment, etc., to do their job. Company officers may report to either, depending on how the rank structure is set up. So let's say you may have a captain in logistics and a lieutenant at a station officer. Technically, that captain is still above that lieutenant, and it is quite possible that that lieutenant may need to report to that captain. Staff duties may be assigned to line personnel. In smaller organizations and combination departments, and even volunteer departments, many times these staff functions are handled by the line personnel. Due to budgetary restraints, they don't have the means or the facilities perhaps to hire someone, so to speak, to handle the staff duties. So they in turn delegate it to a member in the line. So for example, looking at our chart here, you could have the chief, and we don't have any finance or say maintenance or logistics, and you could assign somebody within one of the 3 battalions, like each battalion chief, to handle logistics, one to handle maintenance, and say one to handle personnel issues. Now we talked a little bit about decision-making authority, and it can be centralized or decentralized. Now, authority is the legal ability of individual or individuals to make, implement decisions for which individuals are held accountable for. Company officers has changing decision-making roles throughout an incident. So when we look at our centralized decision-making, the decisions are made by one person at the top. It works well in small organizations. In larger organizations, such as fire departments with, say, 80, 100, 200 people, then the span of control may be exceeded unless the authority is delegated. And span of control, depending on what textbook you want to look at, you're looking anywhere between 3 and 7, with 5 being optimal. And span of control, it basically has to do with the fact of how many people can one individual successfully supervise before things get out of control. Accountability for decisions is almost always centralized. The chief delegates authority to officers to make decisions and implement plans. And the chief is accountable still for said decisions that are made by people below him or her. The chief is accountable to such agencies that have jurisdiction or authorities that have jurisdictions, AHA, for example, the public or other governmental agencies. Central authority CEOs basically make all of the decisions. So in a fire department, if you had just a fire chief making all the decisions for the department, they're going to be a very busy individual. Unless they use their subordinates with the decentralized process. At the decentralized process, decisions are made at a lower level. Traditionally, you want the decision made by the lowest level to make things go more smoothly so that your upper levels can focus on things that are right in their wheelhouse, so to speak, or tasks they deal with on a daily basis. The effects of decision is basically reported through the structure. Even though you have a lieutenant that makes a decision on a particular subject, then the information still needs to go up the chain. To work effectively and efficiently, the chief must ensure members understand the organization. And what I mean by that, there are three terms that you need to wrap your brain around, and that is direction, values, and goals. And those are our three bedrock principles that the subordinates should be making their decisions on, or using that as a key factor to determine which way to go with their decision. So what is the direction of the department? What is the goal of the department? And what are their values? With the decision-making authority, as I said, it should be delegated to lower levels as possible. Limit to only those tasks over which a person has been given authority to make said decisions and deal with. It may be decentralized to make certain decisions only in specific areas. So you may have a lieutenant that may be tasked with making decisions on ordering supplies. And that whole gambit of things, that's the only thing that that individual can do. And I say lieutenant, so that may not be a good choice of a rank, but let's say a driver, for example. That would be a good task. So they're given one specific thing, say the ability or the authority to order supplies for the station, and then that's his job. However, they're not going to have authority to make decisions on such things as vacation time. In this particular model, it allows for decisions to be handled quickly in most matters. And as I said, it allows the upper management to make decisions and other things that they're directly responsible for. It does require the report of decisions that affect, but not the details. So let's say that back to that driver that ordered supplies. He would need to report that, yes, I ordered supplies and the cost is for the month $2,000. Now, do they really care in administration that that's 500 rolls of toilet paper, 600 rolls of paper towels, and 20 gallons of truck wash? Not really, unless it becomes an issue where they have nothing but, say, toilet paper at the station, even though I do think that is a very important thing to have. So your policies must define what decisions can be made and under what conditions. And they need to review the system to ensure that it is accurate and accountable, and you're holding people accountable for their choices. And you give them some sort of parameter on how much they can spend and things of that nature. So you're in charge of this. You have this much money, and don't let us run out of things, and go forth and do good would be a good example of setting parameters for that individual to follow. So once a task has been delegated to a subordinate, then we need to talk about authority. So not only are you giving them a task, but you have to give them the authority to do the job, as well as direction and resources to accomplish it. This is what I want you to do. Take care of it. These are your parameters, and here's the stuff you need. Decisions to delegate can be often difficult. Officers may worry that the task will not be completed in a manner that meets the organizational standards. Because ultimately, even though, let's say, an officer delegates something to be done, it is his responsibility to ensure the task is ultimately done, even though he is putting it on the shoulders of someone else. Concerns, however, can be alleviated through training programs that build knowledge, skills, abilities, and trust with said subordinates. And ultimately, I do believe that any good leader, especially a company officer, needs to be cultivating the men and women underneath them to take that next step in that structure, that chain of command, so that they are ready to go when the call to the bullpen happens. Or let's say something happens and the officer's not there. So he knows or she knows that things will be handled appropriately. When you choose somebody to do something and it's delegated, you need to make sure that they can handle the job. And you need to look for appropriate challenges for said subordinates. Once they begin to handle these jobs, it is going to increase their skill set and their knowledge and their confidence in said job. And then you're going to need to look for something else to keep them busy, so to speak, or you may get them to hand that job off to someone else and give them another one. That way it allows, again, for growth, as I said. Authority and responsibility do go hand in hand. Delegation must be accomplished with appropriate authority, trust that the individual will achieve the desired results, and use the proper methods. What I mean by there, you may give somebody the task to handle a certain job or things of that nature and the authority to do it, but you want to make sure that they handle it in such a way as to complete the task and not abuse that power. So let's say that you give the officer or the driver a task to wax all the fire trucks, and you give them the ability to recruit help from the firefighter ranks. Well, yes, you want to make sure that they ultimately get the job done and they do it correctly and they do it in the right way. You would not want them to say, abuse said power and use it as a form of punishment and get all the firefighters out of bed at, say, 2 in the morning because they're there for 24 and say, hey, we need to wax the trucks. And even when you're assigning the task, you need to, again, go back to the top and make sure that you identify when you want them to have it done, the directions, and the needed resources to do the job. So that again goes back to anytime you delegate something, give the authority, the direction, and the resources, and let them accomplish that task. A lot of people want to micromanage when they become a new officer or company officer, and that sometimes doesn't go very well with the subordinates. You give them the marching orders and then you let them do their job. Otherwise, you might as well just go ahead and do it yourself, is the mindset of a lot of individuals. Hey, I want you to get the station yard day done. And you give that to the driver, and the driver works with the firefighters to accomplish it. You would not want to go out there and then start spouting, telling the driver, "Hey, I want you to cut the grass." The firefighter wants you to trim the hedges, and the other firefighter will want you to weed eat. That would be the FAO's job. Otherwise, again, why did you even assign him or her the task? Let's talk about unity of command. And I don't want you to get confused with a NIMS term of unified command. Unified command is the one where you have 2 or 3 people in charge and they sit down together and then they make objectives for the incident and then disseminate orders on down, so to speak. So unity of command states that each subordinate must have only one supervisor. Again, they only have one supervisor. Possible problems can develop if an employee is required to report to more than one supervisor, because now you have two people telling one person what to do. An employee follows the last order received without performing the previous order from the other supervisor. can cause things not to get done, or to get done, excuse the expression, halfway. Then you have that first officer or supervisor thinking the task had been done, and yet it probably has not been done because, hey, they're also working on another task. Not only can it be confusing for the employee, but it can be confusing for the supervisor, because the employee can turn the tables on the supervisors and kind of do what kids do great, and turn one parent against the other, so that neither supervisor knows what the employee is doing. And the employee may do little or no work at all. They can say to one supervisor, hey, I'm handling this for the other supervisor, and I can't get to it right now. And then when the other supervisor comes up, he can say, hey, I'm handling this for the other supervisor. And they say, okay, don't worry about it. So now they have nothing left to do but to twiddle their thumbs. An employee can also become frustrated while attempting to follow the conflicting orders and gives up and just not do it at all. And then that leads to violations, and the violations lead to confusion, frustration, and ultimately a poor working environment. So with the unity of command and only one person to report to, it does provide adequate direction and accountability. You know that, hey, I've given the task to this individual, and you hold that person accountable for said task. So that allows the worker to be more productive and efficient. Depending on the use of the chain of command, and functional supervisors can play a big role as well with the delegation. As we said, the chain of command has a pathway where people at the bottom report to only one supervisor. And of course, that supervisor should have the appropriate span of control. Again, 3 to 7, with 5 being optimal for the span of control. However, if we look at our rank structure, the folks at the bottom still ultimately are accountable to who? And that would be the chief, or the person at the top. And again, going back down, the supervisor divides the work into specific jobs and assignments without losing control. Another problem that can arise is when the chief issues an order and it filters through the chain. And let's say the lonely firefighter is the next door neighbor with the chief, and they go hunting and fishing on the weekends. And I really don't recommend that personally, because again, that kind of blurs the lines of boss versus friend. So when the subordinate sidesteps the chain of command, the immediate supervisor is taken out of the loop, and the problem goes to a higher officer, and the unity of command is broken. Now, I do believe that there are certain times that sidestepping is appropriate. For example, let's say that a responder in this particular rank structure here feels that they are being, say, sexually harassed by the captain. So they don't feel safe where they can go to said captain about the problem for fear of retaliation or whatever the case may be. So then they report it directly to the fire chief, and then the fire chief is now on hook for said problem. So again, that's something that, depending on the person at the top, should have an open door policy about in terms of their chain of command. Now, when you start sidestepping, it can totally disrupt the unity and the cohesiveness of the unit. And let's say it's an issue where maybe they don't like the order. the supervisor that they attempted to sidestep to should instruct the subordinate to follow the chain of command and take the problem to the immediate supervisor until resolution is achieved. Now, this sidestepping can be avoided by the initial supervisor depending on how they act. And what I mean by that is if they make themselves available to listen to the problems and they have this good demeanor where, they come across, yes, I am the boss, but I have an open door. Let me know what's going on, and then we figure it out together. So they need to be able to listen to the problem sincerely and give active listening a chance where they totally are immersed, so to speak, in the problem of the subordinate, and then they work on the resolution for the problem together so the employee is happy and things get taken care of. Now, let's say that the employee needed new gear, and they tell this to the officer. Well, the officer should then in turn go over to the logistics captain, or whatever the case may be in the rank structure, and handle the problem and get the person new gear. Now, what they need to do is make sure, because this isn't maybe an overnight thing, but talk to the subordinate and let them know the resolution of the problem. And then, of course, that officer is going to take it up the chain of command to get the problem resolved. Now let's change gears for a minute and talk about the concept of functional supervision, which allows workers to report to multiple supervisors. And we did basically talk a minute ago and said how that can cause confusion, but there are certain times where this is appropriate. Because, we know that this deviates from the unity of command. But when the person needs something that, say, that their immediate supervisor has no control over or command, they may instruct said subordinate to go to the person to handle the issue. So let's take a step back and again look at that the gear issue. The responder goes to the captain and say, hey, I need a new station job share because mine's been ripped on XYZ call. Well, their immediate supervisor has nothing to do with, say, the logistics side of things in terms of uniform. However, the captain over at Station 1, where the clothes closet is, shall we say, or uniform closet does. So they may give functional supervision a go in this premise and allow the subordinate to report directly to said captain that handles that particular deal with uniforms and see about getting the problem resolved. In order for this to work well, supervisors must communicate with each other and closely coordinate their activities so you don't have the duplication of efforts. So you would not say that the initial captain would say, call over to the other captain and say, hey, I got a man coming over for uniforms. And then that captain says, hey, sorry, we don't have that person's size. We're going to have to order some more. So then the captain in charge of the uniform goes to the chief and say, hey, I need money or XYZ to order uniforms for the first responder. Now, you would not want the original captain, after saying, hey, we don't have that size, to go to the chief as well and say, we need to order uniform size XYZ for my guy, because then you're back to that whole duplication of efforts and can lead to confusion. Now, that was a non-emergency issue. What if it was on a fire scene? Again, communication is a must between the two captains. So let's say you have Captain 1 on the back side of a building that's on fire, we'll say the Delta side, takes one of the firefighters or the responders and sends them to go back to the truck to retrieve an axe so that they may make forcible entry into the back door. While en route to the truck, that responder is sidelined by another captain. And that captain tells him, hey, I need you to grab a line off of our truck and start cooling exposures. So again, see how that could be an issue when you have that functional supervision where you have captains that are carte blanche, over all people below them. So it is important that, let's say, Captain 2 says, hey, I'll get with your captain and we'll get the axe to him. This is more important right now, and make sure that that communication takes place so that the job gets done. Okay, some food for thought. What are some tactics company officers can use to communicate effectively while using functional supervision? And again, I do think that this is mainly on non-emergency activities. So with that, some non-emergency activities, a way for them to communicate would be to schedule regular meetings with the other supervisors to make sure that they're all on the same sheet of music. Include other supervisors in any correspondence, such as emails with subordinates, and ask for regular updates from said subordinate. So going back to that original request for a uniform, you would say, Supervisor 1 could email the other captain, CC'd the subordinate, and ask for uniforms. Well, when the uniforms are not available in that person's size, then again, that captain in charge of uniforms, captain number 2, would say, email the firefighter or that subordinate and say, hey, we don't have the size. I'm going to get with the chief and get you some ordered. They could also CC an email to that firefighter's immediate supervisor that sent them that way. That way, communication is still going on at all levels, and everyone knows what's going on. We alluded to this a little bit earlier about span of control when I said it's the number of subordinates one individual can effectively supervise. And there's no absolute rules on it. However, most good practices say 3 to 7 with 5 being optimal. Wider span controls can have advantages in non-emergency operations, though it is not recommended for a majority of emergency operations. And this all goes back to our lovely NIMS, or the National Incident Management System. Let's talk about some variables that can affect the span of control. And that is simply the ability and experience of the supervisor. When a supervisor has been doing the job for a while, they may be able to handle multiple things at once, so to speak, as opposed to focusing on 1 or 2 tasks. The ability and experiences of the subordinate. So if you've got a good crew or crews that know the job, know how to get things done, it makes it easier on that supervisor. The nature of the task also plays a huge role. Is it something that is extremely urgent? And what about the conditions under which it must be performed? Is it something very nonchalant, or is it something immediate or life-threatening? And not only that, but how complex is that task? Another thing to consider is the rate at which it must be performed. Is it something that has to be done yesterday, or do they have time? And it always seems the the less time we have to do a task, the more in a hurry we are, and the chance that something is going to get missed or someone is going to get hurt. How similar is this task to things they have done before, or how different it is? How close are the subordinates to the supervisor and each other when doing said tasks? So the proximity. What kind of communication is going to be going on? Is it easy? Is it reliable? Or is it something that's going to be tedious and hard to communicate? Then that will require more direct supervision or watching of said task to make sure that everything goes okay. And what are the consequences of the mistake? What happens if things don't get followed correctly? Is it going to be minor consequences, or is it going to be something catastrophic? Effective supervision is easier when the tasks are relatively simple and repetitive, meaning they've done it a lot of times before. It's also simpler if the workers are well trained, and that's something that they've done a lot. Effective supervision is extremely difficult when the tasks being performed are very complex. The worker's level of training is minimal and may not be sufficient to the task. Workers are widely separated from the supervisor and each other. Sometimes you can work on said variables and it can be managed and minimized, but other times you can't. Examples of proper span of control include when a company officer supervises members of one company, such as a strike team leader supervises company officers in charge of engines in a strike team. This goes back to our NIM terminology when you've got strike teams and you have individual resources. If an IC fails to delegate authority properly, the span of control may be exceeded. An IC may attempt to directly control the entire incident, and that's making all the decision at all levels, and they can become quickly overwhelmed. And it can cause chaos. Our chief has arrived on scene. Is that what that stands for? Okay, bad joke. A breakdown in communication and coordination, confused, inefficient operations, and at best, perhaps, or I should say at worst, loss of life and property. Division of labor, which divides large jobs into smaller tasks that are assigned to specific individuals to get the whole thing done. And a good example I like to bring up on this is the old saying or adage, how do you eat an elephant? And the response is one bite at a time. By breaking something as large as an elephant down into individual things, the task will eventually get accomplished. But in order to do division of labor, it is important for assigning responsibility to individuals and keeping up with accountability on who's doing what. So you don't have duplication of efforts. Making specific, clear-cut assignments helps you to do this job. A lot of times, emergency service organizations are organized into divisions. Within work assignment groups, you have subgroups that are assigned to complete specific tasks, as seen here in our chart. Work groups created based upon following elements such as the type of task and their organization. Commonly place emergency work tasks into similar groups and assign personnel and equipment to handle these tasks. So let's say you have a unit for example, say a squad, and this squad is a special unit within your department, and they're tasked with handling such things as search, rescue, and confined space. So that would be a good example of how you would assign those functions to that one particular group to handle. Another way to divide things up, as opposed to specialties teams, would be geographical. Again, this goes back to our NIMS, so ICS 100 and 700 stuff. You can assign tasks based on geography, or districts, or battalions within an organization's response area to handle. Other things to consider when making these assignments or the division of labor is, time of year, available resources, and again, skill specialization. Only give tasks to groups that will be able to handle the task, and not ones that are only vaguely familiar. Cross-training helps with division of labor. By having groups that know more than one job, it allows the incident commander to more effectively handle the situation by handling a task to more than one group and not have to worry that, I only have one group that can handle search and rescue, or I only have one group that's really good at confined spacing. And granted, we have some groups that are always going to be better than others, but by having them cross-train, you've got say Engine Company 1, which is really good at search and rescue and confined space, and then you have Engine Company 2 that's also trained or cross-trained in search and rescue and confined space. Then it allows you more flexibility as an incident commander on who you assign to do what. Learning Objective 2. Explain the purpose of fire and emergency service organization. Learning Objective number 3 in this next section. Identify classifications of fire and emergency service organizations. Fire and emergency service organizations are categorized based on how the organization is funded, whether it be public or private. Public entities are funded by tax dollars, such as your municipalities, as cities and county ran fire departments. You have other organizations, such as private organizations, that are funded through that particular agency, such as Rural Metro, for example, which is now part of AMR. That is an example of one of the first private fire departments. It was a company that came in and offered fire protection to cities, towns, and businesses at a cost. And then that municipality would pay the cost to that private organization, and then that private organization would provide the service. And just because it was fire or EMS, it didn't matter. It was still a service they were paying for. Another example of private service could be your refineries, your oil companies, your petrochemical fields. They have their own, a lot of times, industrial firefighters. When we look a little closer at our public organizations, they can be divided even further. And that could be such as your municipality, meaning your local fire departments, as in cities or districts, on up to your county. And within that county, you can have them divided up in areas. A lot of times your volunteer departments have fire districts where you have, 10 different fire chiefs that report to, say, a county manager, but then they handle everything within that part of their county, or shall we say, district. Then you have your state or provincial organizations, and I can't think of any real state firefighter jobs off the top of my head. And then you have your federal or tribal, and those are ones that receive their funding from the federal government. A good example would be on your Indian reservations. They are funded by the federal government, and this opens up a whole ball of wax, and we'll get to this a little later in terms of federal funding and reservations and how those are their own little separate entity, and they're kind of immune on these tribal levels from local, county, and state issues. Another example of federal firefighters would be, say, at military bases, or the Department of Energy has their own fire department at the strategic oil reserves. Maybe the nuclear waste facilities, such as Carlsbad, New Mexico, they have their own federal fire department that looks after the needs on that particular establishment. On that private sector, we did talk a little bit about the chemical or the petroleum based. And the businesses maintain their own resources and services. A lot of times it can be mutual aid agreements as well, where their fire department is private, but then they respond out to the community if need be, and vice versa. In your private organizations, you also have for-profit and non-for-profit. In the case of, say, Rural Metro, AMR, that would be an example of a private entity that is for profit. And then your other private ones would be, say, a non-profit entity. So that would be like, okay, the Georgia Fire Academy. They have their own fire service there. That is not only an example of a state-ran fire service where they get their tax dollars from, but they're not there to make a profit or money. Learning Objective 4. List the types of organizational staffing in the fire service. When you look at staffing in any department, whether it be paid or volunteer, public or private, it can kind of be broken down into these four categories. The one that we're most familiar with is career or your full-time fire departments. And those are the ones where individuals are paid, so to speak, to work at the fire department. They do the traditional schedule, 24 on, say, 48 off, or whatever the case may be. But they're there 24-hour days, 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. Kind of like the Waffle House, right? The other to the right here is a volunteer. And again, they provide fire protection, but they do it on a volunteer basis. A lot of times we're familiar with your volunteer folks in your more rural cities or communities where they can't afford to have full-time firefighters, or maybe their call volume just doesn't warrant it. So then they train individuals to respond to fires. And anytime they're free or available within their community, then they respond to help out their fellow neighbors in their time of crisis. You have combination departments where you have a lot of times groups that assign, say, one firefighter there that they pay to get the engine to the call, and then you have volunteers that show up to help put the fire out. And then lastly, you have paid on call, which basically, to me, is kind of like a volunteer type department, but they get paid for any instances they go out on, and say maybe it's 10, 15, or 25 bucks, or whatever the case may be. Objective 5. Identify the role of Company Officer 1 in resource allocation. Resource allocation has its challenges, but allocating resources available while staying within the physical limitations. Financial constraints that limit production provided and method by which the services are provided. To provide adequate protection in a jurisdiction, they must be judicious with resources and plan well for emergency response. So basically, you're going to give somebody a task, and with that task, you're going to give them certain parameters to follow. So let's say you may have a station captain, and let's say that you task them with staffing the station, say 24 hours a day, 365 days a year, and they have 10 people to choose from, and you only have X amount of money to do that job. Well, that captain now has to make the schedule and practice due diligence with the finances and be good stewards of the money in order to make it through the year. So that would be, okay, well, I want to say I put 4 people on the fire truck 24 hours a day. And he begins or she begins doing that. And then halfway through the year, they run out of money. And that's not being a good steward of the tax dollars or the money they have. So they need to look and say, okay, maybe we'll only do, say, 2 people a year or 1 person a year, or maybe staff more people there during busy times, or whatever they need to do to extend the budget to make it to the end. Learning objective number 6. Describe the use of aid agreements in the fire service. And this basically is looking at mutual aid, automatic aid, and outside aid. Mutual aid is upon request. So let's say you have fire department A, and they have a call. And a good example of this would say be a city department. You have a small city department. They get a structure fire within their jurisdiction. They go to fight said fire, and maybe they need additional help. So then they will request aid from a neighboring city, community, or county, and then they come in to help. Something that's a little different would be, say, automatic aid. Where mutual aid is requested, automatic aid is automatically dispatched, like the name implies, to an incident. So let's say you have a fire call that goes out at the edge of one jurisdiction, and you only have 1 station out there. But you have a county unit that is, say, 5 miles away. Well, when said call goes out, the 911 dispatch sends both the city and the county unit to that particular incident automatically without asking for permission. And then you have outside aid. And outside aid generally involves payment for services or bringing somebody in to help with an assigned a task. Or it could be something like GMAG, or Georgia Mutual Aid Group, where you have the Chiefs Association that kind of helps allocate resources to individuals that are hard hit. Like, say, a natural disaster that goes on at the coast, and then they start getting folks to start backfilling coming from neighboring jurisdictions. And it's kind of like a pebble that's been thrown in water. You know, you have a still, very serene lake where you're sniding waves, and you throw a pebble in there or a rock, then you have ripples going out forward until eventually everything is smoothed out. That is a good example of it. Aid agreements may be entered into for a variety of reasons, such as state or federal funding, shared resources, assisting neighbor jurisdictions, tit for tat. Hey, we help you when we need help, and you help us when we need help. You may go into them because, hey, you need to meet operational requirements. Let's say that jurisdiction A has hazmat and you don't. So you get them to come out to help on hazmat scenes, and then you respond to their high-angle rescue. That way, in a geographical area, you're not having everybody kind of, 10 different hazmat teams when you only need one, so to speak. It does help organizations meet accreditation requirements. And then, of course, define response area methods, assess with high-risk hazards or facilities, and provide quicker responses. Summary. Emergency services must fulfill their mission. And with that, it has to be effective and efficient. Organizational based, be it public, private, career, volunteer, or combination, we have a job to do and we need to get it done. We all share the same basic principles in the desire, whether it be routine activities or emergency incidences. Company officers must know and use these principles to be effective leaders in any emergency and non-emergency situations. So, feel free to go ahead and knock out the Chapter 2 review questions, as well as the Week 2 lessons assignment that you can find in Blackboard on the folder. If you have any questions, feel free to contact me in the office at 706-357-0162 or email me at aroberts@athenstech.edu. Feel free to look in the calendar for the virtual office hours for those that would like to discuss things further in a face-to-face type environment. Thank you very much and have a great day.